The number 30 has a particular resonance in British weather. It is the threshold at which the language changes. Below it, the British media reports warm weather with a certain cautious optimism, pleasant, settled, a welcome stretch of sunshine after the grey weeks that too often define the British spring. Above it, everything shifts. Heatwave alerts are issued, health warnings are published, hospital trusts activate their heat emergency protocols. The phrase dangerous heat appears in headlines that would have seemed almost comedic to someone reading a British newspaper 30 years ago, when 30 degrees in the United Kingdom was a rarity so exceptional that it generated national celebration rather than national concern. That threshold is now approaching. The atmospheric pattern that has been building over the past several weeks, a configuration of the jet stream, the pressure systems over the Atlantic and the European continent, and the temperature of the ocean surfaces that are feeding energy into the evolving setup, is aligning toward conditions that will push temperatures in parts of the United Kingdom above 30 degrees Celsius, not briefly, not in a single sheltered location on a particularly still and cloudless afternoon, across multiple major cities, sustained over multiple consecutive days. In a sequence that meteorologists are tracking with the kind of careful and sustained attention that precedes the issuance of formal heat health alerts. The question that millions of people across the country are now asking is not whether the 30-degree heat wave is coming. The models are in sufficient agreement on the direction of travel that the question is moved decisively on from whether to when and to where. Which cities feel the heat first? How many weeks separate us from the peak? What the sequence of the warmth's arrival will look like as it moves across the country from south to north, from the dense urban heat islands of London and the southeast toward the cities of the Midlands and the north that will feel the wave arrive days after it has already established itself in the south. Today, we are going to answer those questions as fully and as honestly as the science of weather forecasting allows, and explain why the answers matter more than they once did in a country whose relationship with 30 degrees has been permanently, irreversibly changed by a decade of record-breaking summers that have made the exceptional feel, with increasing frequency, like something else entirely. The atmospheric setup that is driving this heat wave is one that British meteorologists and climate scientists have come to recognize with a familiarity that would have surprised their predecessors a generation ago. At its core is a high-pressure system, an anticyclone, that is building over or near the Iberian Peninsula and extending a ridge of high pressure northward across France toward the British Isles. High-pressure systems bring settled, dry, and increasingly warm weather because the air within them descends, compressing and warming as it sinks, and suppressing the cloud formation that would otherwise interrupt the solar heating of the surface below. When that high-pressure system is anchored over the sun-baked land surfaces of Spain and Portugal, which by this point in the year are already carrying significantly more solar heat than the United Kingdom, the air it feeds northward toward Britain carries a thermal signature that becomes measurable before the full heat event itself arrives. The signature appears first in the overnight minimum temperatures. Before the days turn genuinely hot, the nights stop cooling down in the way that the British climate normally allows. The minimum temperature that would typically be expected, the post-midnight drop that lets bodies and buildings recover from the previous day's warmth, fails to materialize because the southerly flow is delivering air that retains warmth even through the long spring night. This failure of nighttime recovery is one of the earliest and most reliable indicators that a significant heat event is building. And it is a signal that public health authorities monitor closely because it is the sustained and accumulated heat, the combination of hot days and insufficiently cool nights, rather than the peak daytime temperature and isolation that drives the most serious health consequences. The jet stream's position is the other critical ingredient. In its normal early summer configuration, the jet stream flows roughly across the latitude of northern Britain, steering Atlantic low-pressure systems along a track that brings cloud and rain across the country with sufficient regularity to prevent sustained heat from building. When the jet stream shifts northward, displaced poleward by the expanding high-pressure building to its south, that steering mechanism is removed. The Atlantic systems are deflected away. The high pressure settles, the southerly flow intensifies, and the heat builds day by day as the land surface under cloudless skies absorbs solar radiation without the cloud cover or rainfall that would normally interrupt the accumulation. The models are showing exactly this configuration, developing with an increasing consistency that forecasters take seriously. The jet stream is tracking north of its seasonal normal position. The high pressure is building over Iberia and extending its influence northward. The southerly flow is strengthening. The days of cloud and showers that have characterized the unsettled spell preceding this pattern are giving way to something very different, something that the calendar would associate with the height of summer rather than the weeks that lead into it. The geography of how a heat wave arrives in the United Kingdom follows a pattern, consistent enough to support fairly specific predictions about which cities will feel the heat first, and how the warmth will propagate across the country over the course of the event. London is almost invariably the first major city to record the highest temperatures during a UK heatwave, and it reliably sits among the cities recording the most extreme values at the peak. This is not simply because London is in the south and therefore geographically closer to the warm air source, though that contributes. It is primarily because London is one of the most pronounced urban heat islands in the world, a city of 9 million people whose density of buildings, roads, vehicles, dark surfaces, and human activity generates and retains heat in quantities that create a persistent and substantial temperature differential with the surrounding countryside. The urban heat island effect in London is measurable, significant, and well documented in scientific literature. On a typical summer day, central London can run 3 to 5 degrees warmer than rural areas at the same latitude, just 30 or 40 kilometers away. During a heat wave, that differential amplifies further. The dense fabric of the city, the brick, concrete, tarmac, and glass that absorbs solar radiation during the day and releases it slowly throughout the night, means that London's urban core does not cool down overnight in the way that less dense, less built environments do. The residual heat released by the fabric of the city. The heat generated by millions of air conditioning units pushing warmth from interiors into the street-level atmosphere. The thermal contribution of millions of vehicles and the metabolic heat of millions of human bodies. All of it contributes to a thermal environment that systematically magnifies the impact of any incoming heat wave. After London, the heat typically spreads into the broader southeast and into East Anglia, the counties of Kent, Essex, Suffolk, and Norfolk, where flat terrain and predominantly open agricultural land provides less natural cooling than forested or hilly landscapes would, and where the proximity to the European continent allows warm southerly air to arrive, with relatively modest modification by the cooler surface temperatures of the English Channel and the North Sea. The South Coast cities, Brighton, Southampton, Bournemouth, Portsmouth, experience the heat early but often find it slightly moderated by the sea breeze effect from the Channel, which can take the very peak off afternoon temperatures, even when the broader region is recording extremes. For residents of these cities, the heat wave is felt most acutely on the days when the southerly flow is strong enough to suppress the sea breeze entirely, when the warm continental air pushes all the way to the coast without the Channel surface providing its usual ameliorating influence. The Midlands, Birmingham, Nottingham, Leicester, Coventry, Derby, typically experience the heat wave's peak 1 to 2 days after the southeast, as the warm air mass extends northward and the substantial urban heat island effects of those cities begin to amplify the incoming warmth. Birmingham, in particular, as the second largest city in England, has a heat island effect that is significant enough to push its peak temperatures close to those recorded in London during major heatwave events, even though its latitude would predict cooler conditions. Further north, Manchester, Leeds, Sheffield, Newcastle, the heat arrives later and is typically moderated compared to the south, buffered by greater distance from the warm air source and by the maritime influence of both the Irish Sea to the west and the North Sea to the east. But later and somewhat cooler does not mean without impact. Cities in the north of England are, if anything, less infrastructurally and culturally prepared for significant heat than London and the southeast, precisely because it arrives less frequently, and the built environment, the housing stock, and the public health infrastructure of northern cities reflects a history of climate that has been meaningfully cooler. The specific question of how many weeks away the peak of this heat wave sits requires an honest and careful engagement with what weather forecasting at extended range can and cannot reliably tell us. Modern numerical weather prediction is remarkable by the standards of any previous era. The European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecasts, widely regarded as operating the world's most accurate global forecast system, can now provide a useful skill in temperature forecasting, out to 10 days with high confidence and increasingly to 2 weeks for broad-scale atmospheric patterns. Beyond 2 weeks, the skill of individual deterministic forecasts decreases substantially, but ensemble forecasting, running multiple slightly different model simulations to capture the full range of plausible atmospheric evolutions, can still provide meaningful probabilistic information about the likelihood of different temperature regimes. What the ensemble systems are currently showing for the United Kingdom over the coming weeks is a consistent and increasingly confident signal toward above normal temperatures, with the highest confidence period. The period where the greatest proportion of ensemble members agree on significantly above normal warmth, falling within the 2 to 3 week window from now. The spread within the ensemble beyond that point is larger, reflecting genuine and irreducible uncertainty about the precise timing and longevity of the heat event. For city-specific impact, the most reliable guidance is in the 7 to 10 day forecast window, where deterministic model guidance retains real skill. Within that window, the signal for above normal temperatures building across the southeast is clear and consistent across multiple independent forecast systems. The 30-degree threshold in London and the broader southeast appears comfortably within reach in that window for the warmer scenarios, with the peak of the event, if the atmospheric pattern develops as the models currently suggest, falling within a 2 to 3 week time frame, when the high pressure is forecast to be most firmly and persistently established. The honest, scientifically grounded answer to how many weeks away is this: the first significant warmth, with temperatures approaching 30 degrees in the southeast, is within the reliable 10-day forecast range. The peak of the event, with 30-degree temperatures potentially widespread across multiple cities from London to the Midlands, sits in the 2 to 3 week window, far enough out that forecast uncertainty is real, close enough that preparation should be underway rather than deferred. The health implications of a sustained 30-degree event across UK cities are serious, well evidenced, and deserve the full attention that the formal heat health alert system is designed to generate. 30 degrees in the United Kingdom is not 30 degrees in the Mediterranean. It is not experienced by a population adapted over generations to warm summers, that has built its homes with shuttered windows and thick stone walls designed for passive cooling, that has organized its daily rhythms around midday rest, that has developed the physiological acclimatization that comes from regular heat exposure. It is experienced by a population the vast majority of whose homes have no air conditioning, whose sleeping spaces are frequently in upper floors under roof insulation designed to retain rather than exclude heat, and whose bodies arrive at each summer with significantly less heat acclimatization than populations in southern Europe bring to temperatures that are actually higher. The clinical evidence on heat mortality in the United Kingdom is unambiguous and has been accumulating for 2 decades. The 2003 European heatwave killed an estimated 2,000 people in the United Kingdom. The record-breaking July 2022 event, when temperatures exceeded 40 degrees Celsius for the first time in British history, produced excess death estimates running into several thousands across the weeks of elevated temperature. More moderate events, sustained periods at or above 30 degrees with warm nights preventing recovery, produce measurable and statistically significant increases in mortality, concentrated among the elderly, people with cardiovascular and respiratory conditions, those taking medications that impair heat regulation, and those without access to cool environments. The specific mechanism by which sustained heat causes mortality is worth understanding clearly, because it informs the public health response that is most effective. The primary danger is not the peak afternoon temperature. It is the accumulation of heat stress in the body over multiple days when overnight temperatures remain elevated, when the body cannot fully cool down before the next day's heat adds to the existing burden. A body that cannot restore its thermal equilibrium overnight cannot sustain an adequate physiological response to the following day's heat. Over multiple consecutive days, that accumulated deficit becomes dangerous, particularly for bodies whose thermoregulatory capacity is already reduced by age, illness, or medication. This is why the overnight temperature forecasts matter as much as the daytime maxima in any serious heatwave assessment. And it is why the warm nights that accompany this event, a direct consequence of the southerly flow delivering air that retains heat even after sunset, are being watched as carefully by public health authorities as the headline afternoon temperatures that will feature in the news coverage. The infrastructure of UK cities will be tested by sustained 30-degree temperatures in ways that are now familiar from recent events but have not yet been adequately addressed by the investment and adaptation that familiarity should have prompted. The London Underground presents the most acute and most publicized infrastructure challenge. Bored through Victorian brick at depths and in tunnel geometries that make retrofitting modern climate control engineering essentially impossible at any practical cost, the Underground's deep tube lines become genuinely hazardous environments when surface temperatures reach 30 degrees. The heat generated by the train's braking systems, by the electrical infrastructure, and by the metabolic and body heat of millions of passengers has nowhere to dissipate in sealed tunnels whose thermal mass has been accumulating heat since the start of the warm spell. Tunnel air temperatures during major heatwave events regularly exceed 40 degrees on some lines, a level that constitutes a genuine health risk for passengers who are elderly, pregnant, or have cardiovascular conditions. Transport for London has implemented limited ventilation improvements and trial cooling systems in recent years, but the fundamental thermal problem of the deep tube network admits no affordable solution within any realistic planning horizon. Surface rail presents related but distinct vulnerabilities. Steel rails expand significantly with heat and can buckle at surface temperatures that, during an intense heat wave, are substantially exceeded even when the ambient air temperature is below the worst recorded extremes. Network Rail responds to forecast heat events by implementing precautionary speed restrictions across vulnerable sections of the network. Restrictions that slow journey times, reduce capacity, and generate cascading delays on a rail network that, during the summer months, is already carrying elevated leisure travel demand. Road surfaces on older sections of the network soften under prolonged intense heat, creating rutting and surface deformation under heavy traffic loads that requires urgent remediation and can produce dangerous driving conditions before it is addressed. Highway authorities have progressively treated the most vulnerable sections of major roads with heat-resistant surface dressings in the years since the 2022 heat wave demonstrated the scale of this problem across the network. But coverage remains incomplete, particularly on secondary roads and in local authority areas where maintenance budgets have been under sustained pressure. Power networks face the particular combination of elevated demand from the limited but growing number of air conditioning units in commercial and residential buildings and reduced capacity of overhead transmission infrastructure, which loses efficiency as ambient temperatures rise. In extreme cases, the combination of high demand and reduced capacity creates conditions where the network's operating margins narrow uncomfortably. The risk of supply interruptions, while not high in absolute terms, is meaningfully elevated during sustained heat events compared to normal operating conditions. For those cities that will feel this heat wave first and most intensely, the window for effective preparation is now, not in the days immediately before the peak, when options are more limited, and the systems that need activating are under more pressure. At the municipal level, the priority is activating the heat emergency frameworks that the experience of 2003, 2018, and 2022 has built into local authority planning. That means confirming that cooling centers in public buildings, libraries, leisure centers, shopping centers, community halls are identified, staffed, and publicized to those who need them. It means activating the outreach programs that check on elderly people living alone, who represent the demographic most statistically at risk during heat events and who are most likely to be isolated from the informal social networks that would otherwise notice early signs of heat-related deterioration. It means coordinating with NHS trusts and GP surgeries to ensure primary care is resourced for the increase in heat-related presentations that a sustained 30-degree event reliably generates. For businesses and employers, the duty of care obligations that apply during heat events are not always well understood. Workplaces without adequate ventilation or cooling, particularly warehouses, kitchens, factories, and other environments where physical work generates additional body heat, become genuinely hazardous during prolonged high temperatures. Employers have a legal obligation to manage that risk, which in practical terms means flexible working arrangements, enhanced access to cool water and rest spaces, monitoring of vulnerable employees, and in some cases temporary operational adjustments to avoid the hottest parts of the day. For individuals and households, the preparation that makes the most difference is also the most straightforward. Managing solar gain in the home, closing south and west-facing blinds and curtains during the day to prevent the interior from accumulating heat that will then be impossible to dissipate overnight, is the single most effective passive cooling measure available to most UK households and requires nothing more than a change in routine. Opening windows and creating through drafts during the cooler night hours, even if the difference between indoor and outdoor temperature is small, allows some overnight recovery that a sealed home prevents entirely. Identifying the coolest room in the house, typically a north-facing room on a lower floor, and making it habitable for sleeping during the peak of the event can be the difference between adequate overnight recovery and the dangerous heat accumulation that the medical evidence identifies as the primary mechanism of heat wave mortality. Knowing who among your neighbors and family is most vulnerable and checking on them proactively, not waiting for a visible sign of distress, is the community-level intervention that the public health evidence identifies as one of the most effective in reducing heat mortality. The people who die in UK heat waves are overwhelmingly people who were alone when the heat became dangerous. Neighbors checking on neighbors is not sentiment. It is evidence-based public health. Behind the immediate question of timing in cities lies a deeper story about what a 30-degree heat wave in the United Kingdom now represents, and why it means something different than it did even a decade ago. The United Kingdom's climate has been measurably and significantly warming. The 10 warmest years in the Central England temperature record, the world's longest instrumental climate record, extending back to 1659, have all occurred since 1990. The frequency of days exceeding 30 degrees across England has increased substantially over the past 50 years. The probability of any given summer producing at least one 30-degree day in London has moved from a relatively rare occurrence to something that is now expected in most years. The 40-degree barrier breached in 2022 was predicted by climate models to be essentially impossible in the United Kingdom until the middle of the century. It arrived decades ahead of schedule, and the models that failed to predict its early arrival have been updated in ways that make the probability distributions for future UK temperature extremes considerably more alarming than the previous generation of projections suggested. The 30-degree heat wave that is coming is not an anomaly. It is not a freak event to be filed away as exceptional and then forgotten. It is a data point on a trajectory that the science has been describing for decades. A trajectory toward a UK climate that is warmer, more extreme, and more frequently capable of delivering heat events that the country's infrastructure, its housing, its agriculture, and its public health systems were not built to manage. How many weeks away is the 30-degree heat wave? Closer than most people in the northern cities are currently thinking about. Which cities hit first? London, the southeast, and East Anglia. Already in the forecast window. The Midlands within days of them. The north within a week of the south. The heat is coming. The preparation window is open. And the question that matters most is not the forecast. It is what is done with it.